I'm going to introduce the next panel, and we're waiting for our administrative staff to bring the table tents. So I will introduce them by name, and you'll have to guess who's who, because they won't be labeled in front of you. But
I'm showing this.
we have another outstanding panel here today. Identification on the agenda, if you've looked at. She is a member of the California Teachers Association, but she's also the president of the San Juan Teachers Association. She is on the steering committee of CalTurn, the California Teachers United for Teachers Union Reform Network. And she is a former Teacher of the Year in California from 2011. So she is far more than a member of the CTA. And Rick Miller is the Executive Director of the California Office to Reform Education and was previously Policy Director under Jack O'Connell in the California Department of Education. And in keeping with the format of the previous panel, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to speak for... Oh, Dave. Sorry. My education came under those old standards, and when I read, I skip stuff. I apologize. No, and Dave Gordon, who I'm sure is known to all of you, is the superintendent of the Sacramento County Office of Education and a leader among county superintendents in thinking about the implementation of Common Core and how the counties can support that process. So I'm going to ask each of certainly each of our panelists to speak for about 10 minutes. Arun, Carrie, and John about the research that they've been doing and what they've learned, and then Dave, Shannan, and Rick to respond from the points of view of what they're seeing in the field, what they're seeing among practitioners as the implementation process moves forward. And I will hand over to Arun.
Want me to come up there?
No, you can do it from there.
Okay. So, good afternoon. I think it's almost afternoon. Arun Ramanathan, Pivot Learning Partners. And thrilled to be here. I had an opportunity. Just want to give you first a little bit of background on Pivot. We're one of the largest providers of implementation support for large-scale district initiatives in the state of California. So we work with about 80 school districts across the state, and about in 50 of those we work on Common Core implementation. So I think one of the reasons that David brought us into the research conversation was really to talk about what we're seeing in the field. That's one thing. In terms of the connection with local control funding formula, we're also working with a lot of districts on LCFF, so about 15 districts formally on local control funding formula on the LCAP itself. And we've developed a tool called the P-bar, which is kind of like a turbo tax for the creation of the LCAP. As you all know, the template itself is a robust template, but has some challenges inherent in it. So we tried to make the process a little bit more user-friendly in terms of the creation of the P-bar tool. And what we've been doing is working with districts on using the tool in order to create their LCAP. So in some of these cases, there's an actual overlap. So I'm going to be able to talk to that. What I'm specifically going to be talking about in this context is also the research that we did looking at 11 school districts, some of which we partner with, on implementation of the Common Core in California, and looking at some of the best practices that we found in those districts. The report that we wrote, I don't know if it was available, it's called Getting to the Core, How Early Implementers Are Approaching the Common Core in California. David calls this the glass half full report. And because we found a lot of, positive practices as we looked out there. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about those positive practices. I also want to make a few opening remarks in general about the Common Core. It's interesting thinking about this, and I'm strangely going to channel Rick Simpson here. And because it's interesting thinking about this, that we're actually not going from a no standards period to a standards period. We're actually transitioning from an older set of standards to a newer set of standards. And I can actually remember back in the 90s kind of grappling with the standards themselves. This was in a different state. This was in Massachusetts. And I remember as a young special educator, a student teacher, actually taking the Massachusetts standards, then developing lesson plans in relation to those standards, and then mapping those to student IEPs, their short-term and their long-term objectives. I still have nightmares about that process, right? And I don't know if any of you have ever engaged in that brutal process, but that was the days before the actual implementation, before the actual internet or anything that you could cut and paste and put things together. So we're going through our second round of standards-based implementation. And that was actually a very positive period, I thought, because what we were doing in that period was we were actually grappling with the standards themselves. We were unpacking the standards. We were reading them. We were translating them into lesson plans. We were thinking about them in relation to our pedagogy. And we were looking at them in terms of assessment. There was a lot of wonderful work that went on in that period. And then I think what actually happened was that we took the standards, and we, after several years, and we stuck them in a box, right? And we put them in the attic. And then a layer of dust sort of came out over the top of that box. And the dust is there, and the standards really weren't revisited for a long period of time in the kind of way that they were being looked at in the 90s. And I realized that a few years ago, we actually took that box out of the attic, with the introduction of the Common Core State Standards, pulled it out, and did this process, which we all now seem to call unpacking the standards. We looked at the Common Core State Standards, and we started to engage again in a process of thinking through what they meant in relation to student academic instruction, to student achievement. And it's a process that I actually realized was again happening when a book appeared on my wife's nightstand. She's a teacher in San Lorenzo, called Pathways to the Common Core. Right? Soon it appeared on my nightstand, which meant that I had to read it, right? But it was there, and it was a clear sign that this process was going on. There was something happening inside our districts in relation to the core. And when I looked at the title, I read the book, but I looked at actually the authors on there, and what I realized was that the authors of this book were the same authors of the books that I had read in the late 90s on unpacking the standards back then. So I came to a realization then that everything old is new again, right? So that's kind of the process that we're engaging right now. I also came to the realization that I'm getting old so that I can actually say everything old is new again. So what's going on, right? So we looked at this wonderful process that's happening in these districts, these 11 districts, this dusting off of standards. And I think there's two things that we need to keep in mind. One is, okay, the box is getting unpacked, but it's not like time stopped over the last 10 years, right? We didn't suddenly say we're not going to educate kids, but if you saw that first phase as looking at the standards and deeply digging into the standards, maybe the last 10 years were really about achievement gaps, right? About disaggregation, about looking at the academic achievement of our so-called subgroups. And also the world changed around us at the same time. We really started intersecting with technology in different ways, particularly in terms of learning. So one of the things that we want to see, too, as we think about this process in the 11 districts is how much of the old, became new, how much of the last 10 years is still there, right? This interest and this focus on the academic achievement of subgroups. And then what do we see in terms of technology, particularly the integration of technology into the process of accessing the core? And I think what we saw is some considerable variation, but some very positive variation, glass half full variation in the 11 districts, the early implementers that we looked at. And I think there are some consistent trends, and one of those consistent trends is actually something that I think we should see as positive. So you can characterize the fact that districts picked one or two elements or aspects of the core to dive deep into as a negative. You could say they didn't try to bite off the whole thing all at once. But you also have to remember at the same point, as we approached these districts and we talked with them and worked with them in some cases, there really wasn't the capacity to bite the whole thing off all at once. So what they did was they picked a couple of areas, a couple of focus areas to really dig into, and a couple of core strategies that they invested in to focus on. Two of those were not necessarily ones that also required huge expenditures. So they didn't, in many cases, buy new curriculum. So that wasn't really one of the big focuses. They didn't really buy new assessments. Again, not a big focus. But what they actually did was try to figure out ways from a bottom-up process to engage teachers in the core, right? To engage teachers in the standards themselves. And they used a number of different strategies to get at that. One of them was curriculum development. So what we saw in a lot of districts was the actual process of engaging teachers in a bottom-up process in the process of creating curriculum, the process of creating units, frameworks, And they also, we found, again, when we think about that technology, is an increasing use of those online collaboration portals for teachers across schools and inside districts to collaborate on curriculum design. Now, again, you could look at this as a negative because they were only grappling with a few things. They were focusing in on a few core elements. But from a change management process, we think this was a positive because they were actually getting into the content of the core through this mechanism. The second mechanism that we saw was the process, again, to get engagement, of actually focusing on assessment, right? And having folks develop assessments together. And this, again, is a pretty good process when you think about it. It's kind of different from curriculum, but it's very similar in some ways to thinking about, okay, well, what do students need to learn in order to truly show that they have accessed the core, or what do they need to demonstrate? And then how are we going to construct an assessment that gets to that? So that was the second big strategy that we saw. The third big strategy that we saw was actually looking at the instructional methods. And in this case, we saw a lot of focus on project-based learning in some districts. Again, and particularly at the high school level. Okay, so Common Core is English language arts and mathematics. And the question there was really, how do we engage teachers in other curricular areas in the core? And so some districts were actually using project-based learning as that mechanism to do that, again, at the high school level. So 3 specific types of approaches. Again, not the whole thing, but a way to get into the process. A lot of use of instructional coaches, a lot of use as the supports that districts already had available, knowing, as many folks have commented in this point of time, that we're in a resource-constrained environment, right? So what did we not see? So typically what we didn't see was the broad-scale use of technology as part of Common Core implementation. So we saw one district, Milpitas Unified, that really used a blended learning approach as a driver for Common Core implementation, but that really wasn't repeated in most other districts. And I think folks will talk about the investments that happen in technology, but really in only one district did we see that technology, that the investment in blended learning and personalized learning was a pronounced aspect of their Common Core implementation strategy. The second thing that we didn't see very much of was integration of the ELD standards and a focus on ELD, or a focus on students with disabilities, or a whole lot of integration in the NGSS. And actually, this is kind of interesting because if you think about the first phase of standards-based implementation, student subgroups were kind of an afterthought in that whole process, particularly students with disabilities, until this book, Educating One and All, which is also sitting on my bookshelf somewhere, written by Dr. McLaughlin, came out. But it's actually interesting that we are repeating some of the negatives that happened in the first implementation, particularly when you think about the Common Core, because of the facility that you can utilize the Common Core as a mechanism for differentiation. That's not actually being invested in the same way, or the thought isn't going in the same way for our English learners, for our student disabilities, our non-traditional learners. I think that's something that we have to think about. And as we get reports back from the field, this isn't in the report, but it's in Dr. McLaughlin's report. One thing that we're also seeing, which is something that we should consider as a state that is making an increasing investment in STEM, is not just that the NGSS isn't coming in. It's a point in time where we could think about NGSS as coming in. But we're really emphasizing English language arts versus math, right? And half the Common Core is math, right? But the early implementation is heavily focusing on ELA and PD in ELA, both for principals and teachers. So that's something that we have to think about. So I'll be quick, but just in terms of LCFF, the integration or the lack of intersection with LCFF. So what we're seeing is that these are 2 separate and distinct processes. And that is not a good thing. These are 2 largely bifurcated conversations that are happening in school districts. And it even gets to the engagement process inside school districts. Common Core implementation as an engagement process is being directed at people, right? And at the community. This is what the Common Core is. Structurally, though, when you think about the LCAP, the engagement process is a loop. And so that's actually much more of a true engagement process, right? Feedback coming back, stuff going down, bottom up, top down. And so that's actually interesting that these 2 processes, one a more circular process and one a top-down process, are happening in alignment. And one thing I asked our folks is, well, who's leading this? Is it the budget people are leading the LCAP process and the CNI people are leading the Common Core implementation process? And actually what they said is that CNI people are leading both processes, which is kind of interesting because they're leading two diametrically different processes that are happening at the same time. So I think another thing that's also interesting is that the focus on equity that is implicit, right? Oh, I'm sorry, it's explicit in the LCAP. The focus on equity that we've had for 10, 15 years, is not necessarily as much there with Common Core as it is in the LCAP. So the Common Core has an implicit focus on equity, right? In the way the standards are constructed. And the LCAP is an explicit focus on equity. But those two conversations are not meeting. And that, again, I think is something that we need to talk about in relation to the strength of both initiatives and the intersection between them. And perhaps that's because Common Core implementation really is only one of 8 state priority areas, right? It's just one of them, and in some cases it can be an afterthought state priority area in relation to the LCAP. Lastly, as we're looking at the process of developing LCAPs, and perhaps this is the reason this is happening this year, it was a rushed process. It was rushed towards the end of the budget cycle, and the Common Core implementation process was something that was much more ongoing. What we're hearing is that districts will next year be integrating the two more closely together, and I think that's a very hopeful sign. I think that's particularly a hopeful sign in relation to the equity components of the Common Core integrating with the equity components of local control funding formula. I think, though, it's definitely a danger if we don't see that happening in our state at scale. I think it's something that we should promote, and I think it's also okay to say, particularly for next year, that out of the 8 state priority areas, perhaps Common Core implementation is the most important one and should govern the way the LCAP is actually constructed. And with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Arun. And Carrie Hahnel is from EdTrust West, and EdTrust West has done a great service to the state in compiling an archive of local control accountability plans, and they have also conducted some analysis of what's in the plans, and that's what Carrie's going to talk about.
Right, and shortly before Arun left EdTrust West to join Pivot, I think his parting gift to us as a staff was announcing to a room like this that we were collecting those hundreds of LCAPs. So we've been hard at work on that over the last few months, and I think this is it's good that we're finally bringing these two topics together, local control funding formula and Common Core. As an advocacy, policy, and research organization committed to closing opportunity and achievement gaps in California public schools, we've been advocating for both of those reforms. As researchers, we're following the implementation of those. The team that is actually looking at Common Core implementation in the field is in Brazil at the World Cup, and the other one recently had a baby. So I think I'm third choice for that, but I am looking closely at LCAPs. So what I have tried to do is, with the team at EdTrust West, is take the findings from the field work on Common Core and apply those to the LCAPs. So we've been participating in some statewide consortia looking at best practices with Common Core implementation. And our practice team has been out in the field looking at schools and districts that are really ahead with implementation and documenting the best practices that are emerging in those districts and schools. And the themes that have emerged there really line up well with the ones that Arun shared, which are around capacity building at the district and the school level, building those teacher leaders and those instructional leaders to carry out the work of the Common Core, developing curriculum, and doing so really leveraging the expertise of educators to develop those materials and those curriculum frameworks and those tools, collaboration across the district with community, and finally using technology in a variety of ways, some to assist with instruction, some to document the process of implementation itself, some in support of SBEC. So with those 4 themes that have emerged, what we wanted to do as a staff next is look at this database of LCAPs that we've been collecting and say, how are these emerging in the LCAPs, and to what extent do we see evidence of LCFF and LCAP assisting with Common Core implementation? And I think that's the real driving question. And Common Core and LCFF have sort of collided, and the hope is that LCFF and the new flexibility and the new structure and the new local decision-making that's part of that would help further Common Core implementation. So that's one of the things that we're interested in testing out, and we're just getting a start on that. But I wanted to share some of our initial insights from doing a review of 12 district LCAPs representing 9 large urban districts and 3 smaller rural districts. And the first thing that we find after looking at these is that the LCAP is not a place that lays out the plan for Common Core implementation. Not to say that it was necessarily intended to do that, but the way in which the document is set up and the way in which districts have provided information makes it very difficult to tell what exactly the district's plan is. It's fairly fragmented, partly because of the form itself, and partly because there is generally not a lot of detail. The goals sometimes sound quite good and give us a good sense that things are on track, but when we look at the actions and the accompanying expenditures, our confidence wanes a little bit because there isn't sufficient detail to tell exactly what the district proposes to do. And related to that, there is less information about Common Core implementation in these district plans than we know could be. And knowing some of these districts, we know that they are doing things with Common Core that they actually didn't put in their LCAP. And so in some ways, they're kind of underselling in this community plan what they are doing. One theory on this is that a lot of the Common Core work is funded by the Common Core implementation grants. And because the LCFF does not need to include plans or expenditures beyond the LCFF, they might be excluded. And I think that the biggest case that we see is around technology. There's very little discussion in a lot of these plans about use of technology for infrastructure and devices, with a couple of exceptions, leaving us to think that there perhaps is that information in a separate planning document, which maybe John will tell us about in a moment. And I think this is it presents a problem of policy, which is if we are trying to encourage a planning process with community and we're trying to create transparency into what districts are doing for kids, is there a way to bring these things together a little bit better so that the core academic program, which is really what Common Core is about, is easily accessible in a single place, in a single plan? The next thing that we see is that I'm going to I think some of these points relate to each other. I was going to say that there are very few descriptions, kind of executive summary or kind of summary descriptions of what's in the plan, making it like you kind of have to do this connect the dots exercise where you go through and you line up all these things and you say, I think this is what they're saying, and it would be really helpful if they just said it. And again, that could be something that our state board could address. It could also be something that some districts could just take on their own. San Jose has a really nice executive summary at the front of their LCAP, and a few other districts have included that as well. Okay, Common Core. We're going to talk about Common Core broadly. At least at EdTrust West, we're talking about it broadly, and we're thinking about English and math and science and ELD. And it's very clear that there's NGSS is not being addressed yet. We see, I think in the sample of 12, we found 2 references to NGSS at all, and that's a reference to it, much less a description of what the activities are to support the implementation of NGSS. In regards to English learners, we did see that the LCAP seems to be a good tool, and LCFF in general seems to be a good policy for incentivizing a focus on English learners. We see a lot showing up in these local control and accountability plans related to services and supports for English learners. What's less so there, and is there in about half the cases, is a focus on the ELD standards, an explicit discussion of how to provide additional supports to English learners so that they can access the Common Core. Most of the services that are proposed are ones that have to do with the CELT, with testing, with placement, with reclassification monitoring. There are some references to other kind of academic supports, including some very creative uses of extended learning time for English learners, good investments in bilingual education and expanding bilingual education courses. So there are some things that were very positive that we saw, but we would have liked to see more around the ELD standards explicitly. The thing that stood out as the top investment in Common Core was professional development. Across the board, this is where districts are putting their planning effort and really kind of hanging their hat on this is their theory of change. We see some really promising plans related to teacher collaboration, professional learning communities, a lot of coaching, a lot of train-the-trainer models, investing in teacher leaders, teacher career pathways, all in support of the Common Core. And then finally, we see that some districts, not many, about a third of our sample, were investing in district-level capacity to support the Common Core, hiring additional district leaders to specifically support the teacher training or the implementation and monitoring of Common Core. But in the other two-thirds, what we generally saw is that districts are hoping that the sites will build the capacity locally. And in some cases, we see things like pass-through grants from the district to school sites, specifically around building site capacity to implement the Common Core. So it left us wondering what the district role is in ensuring that schools not only have the funding, the expertise, and the connections and support to do that implementation work. Some of these things connect to other work we've been doing. In addition to the Common Core research in the field we've been looking at what some of our high flyer districts that we've identified through our legacy work, looking at kind of top performing districts, have been doing related to the Common Core, and asking them, how are you leveraging the opportunity of LCFF to continue to do this work? One example we heard from Clovis Unified, which has surfaced at the top of our district report card rankings for the last 4 years, is that they've been investing for a long time in individualized education approaches, similar to an IEP approach, and they're using the opportunity with LCFF, the additional flexibility and the additional funding that they're getting for high-needs students to help accelerate some of that work. So they're investing in a summer 6-week program that they're calling an Accelerated English Language Academy for students in the elementary grades who haven't yet reached proficiency in English. And they're also hiring additional ELD teachers at the secondary level. And finally, they're using their LCFF dollars to expand their summer school program. So we're hearing that sometimes when districts are really already kind of ahead, LCFF gives them a nice boost, but we're not yet hearing that LCFF and LCAP in and of itself is the hook that's incentivizing districts to create a comprehensive plan for Common Core implementation.
Thank you. And one of the requirements attached to the $1.25 billion that the state appropriated for Common Core support was that districts develop a plan in consultation with their communities. And so far as I know, Public Advocates is the only organization that has actually tried to look at those plans, see whether plans were actually created and what's in them. And John's going to talk about that.
Great. Thanks, David. And as David said, the $1.25 billion came with some direction, and that is for districts to issue a plan now that generally says how you're going to spend the money, and then an expenditure plan by July 2015 that you need to send to the state that shows the line item expenditures. So that's where the real expenditure detail will come. But at this point, there's a general plan that was required to be adopted with a public hearing. And so we went to see what exactly has been adopted and where are these plans and what do they say? How is the money being spent? We've handed out a one-page nice color chart here. If you don't have one, you can raise your hand. Liz Gann will pass it out. And I should really give credit to this research and wonderful chart as well, but particularly the heavy lifting of the research was done by Brandon Green, attorney in our office, who's here today, and you can ask him all the hard questions. But what I think what this shows, if you look at the chart, is really there's a lot of variability among the districts, which is probably to be expected and probably a good thing that they can locally determine how to spend their money. There's no really strong patterns. I think that in most districts that the instructional materials was probably less than a third, and that the money was going into professional development and technology, more sort of proportionally higher, And there's not usually a lot of technology support from the state, so I think that this was an opportunity for districts to use funding for the technology. But even that's, not always the case. There are districts that spend a lot of their funds on instructional materials. I think some of the interesting things about these plans, and it relates to the LCFF conversation, are, where is the plan? What do these plans look like? Carrie didn't find it in LCFF, so she's passed the responsibility on to me, and these Common Core implement. Well, they're not here either, is the conclusion. Most of these plans are 1 page long. Some of them are 2. The longest we found was LA Unified, which is 3. A typical plan, this is not, by no means uncommon, is this one I'm looking at from Long Beach, which lays out the statutory requirements, the 3 areas you're supposed to spend it in. Long Beach got, how much did they get? 2 plus 7.3 plus 7. So about $16.3 million. It says Long Beach Unified is allocating $2 million towards additional professional development related to the Common Core standards. That's the sum total of their plan for professional development. Instructional materials, similarly, there's a 1-sentence in the plan saying they're providing $7.3 million towards instructional material related to the Common Core. I guess there's 2 sentences. This includes textbooks as well as supplemental instructional materials. And then they're saying in 1 sentence they're allocating $7 million towards technology. On top of that, there is actually a hedge. This is not common, but we did see this in Long Beach, where they said the district may decide to transfer funds from instructional materials to technology. So it's not even a fixed plan, and they're saying, we may go back and forth between these 2 things. That was the sum total of the Long Beach plan. I think, as I said, there are many districts that did similar or just slightly more than that in their plans. Elk Grove Unified, I thought, it's only 2 pages, but I thought it was a more descriptive plan, and actually a reasonable example of one. They spent most of their money of their 13 or so million dollars on technology, and they explain that they're $2.3 million on installing wireless access points, $5 million on purchasing 8,200 Chromebooks. They lay out the timeline for implementing the Chromebook because it's not all coming at once. They have a nice description of why they went with Chromebooks instead of other, and then $3 million on replacing old computers and $2.2 million on professional development. So I thought that was actually a reasonable plan. LA Unified, as I said, has the longest plan, but also the most troubling in some respects. You'll see from the chart they have this other category of $6.3 million, and those were things I just couldn't fit into professional development technology or instruction materials. And I think a lot of it comes down to underwriting core staff that are somehow related to curriculum instruction with this, one-time grant fund is how I would describe it. So there's $280,000 towards clerical support, $1.3 million to purchase K-2 literacy and Common Core assessments for the SBAC non-tested grades. So they're purchasing assessments, certainly a needed thing, but I couldn't see how that, maybe you could say it's instructional material, but I don't think of that as instructional material. That's an assessment of how well the instructional material worked. It's not technology, it's not PD. $5 million on summer school. to provide summer school to students to assist in the transition to Common Core. Again, I don't think that fits neatly in one of those three categories. And they allocated $39 million to school sites. And one sentence there is schools to follow state guidelines on appropriate use of funds. So they had $113 million, they sent $40 million to school sites, presumably to purchase technology or instructional materials or do professional development, which is not a bad strategy, but it doesn't really tell you in the plan if that's actually being delivered or how it's being delivered or what kind of assurances that the school sites are actually going to use it in that way. So I think the conclusion is that there was not a lot of, sort of disappointingly in these plans of what we had hoped to see, and even no sort of assurance that a district would be spending in the three areas they're supposed to be spending in, two other points, one on transparency, one on how this all fits with LCFF, because this was sort of the first round of what the LCAPs were supposed to look like, right? And this is here's a pot of money, do a plan, have a hearing, and it was less than robust. Now, the transparency requirements around LCFF are a lot better than around this plan, but I can tell you, Brandon had a heck of a time finding these plans. They're not located, on the home site of the website. Most districts do not have a Common Core link even that you could go to and find the plan. So it took a lot of digging on websites. Many of them are, buried as they are in my district at Emory, where I sit on the board, in a board packet in the middle of the year, and you kind of had to find, well, which board meeting did they address this at, and where is that to actually find what the plan is. And, he was calling associate superintendents of districts and having a less than transparent time trying to track these things down. We did some work to try to, improve that transparency and ultimately had some efforts in that in a bill this year, but then, the Common Core bill didn't get funded, so that didn't improve there. But I think for the future, it kind of gets back to Carrie's point of the necessity to have a more robust explanation of how we're implementing Common Core and how, whether it's LCFF dollars or new Common Core sort of block grant dollars, are being spent to implement the Common Core and engage the community in that conversation. I think the things that in our review of LCAPs, and we've looked at a lot too, and public advocates sent letters to about 24 districts suggesting improvements on their LCAPs before they adopted them, but most districts did not, as they were sort of instructed to by the state guidance, did not describe all or nearly all of their LCFF expenditures in the LCAP. They might just do supplemental concentration, they might do their increased expenditures this year, but the idea of the LCAP is you're supposed to describe your LCFF funds to the extent they're implementing 8 state priorities, and as Wested has told districts, you're implementing, the 8 state priorities are nearly all, should cover nearly all of your activities or all your funds. So a lot of what people are doing are Common Core implementation and in terms of teaching and instruction materials, and that it ought to surface in there somewhere. We didn't see that in the LCAPs. We didn't see all of the sub-elements of the 8 state priorities addressed, and we didn't see all of the subgroups often addressed in terms of what was being done to address those. So they were general sort of descriptions and goals, but not the kind of specificity that would really tell you what is this district doing to implement the Common Core. So I think I think that is the future, and we need to, there are going to be improvements in the LCAP template that are going to be released today to the public, and, I think we need to keep refining that process down the road.
Thank you, John. And Dave, you've worn multiple hats in this process, working as a county superintendent, but also with SECESA, with state-level groups working on implementation. So we'll be grateful for your perspectives on this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, David. To John's point about the the plan for the one-time money for Common Core, I think the messaging around that was not that it was supposed to be much of an elaborate plan, that it was you were to choose among the three things and lay out what your needs were. So I agree with him that I think the LCAP is the document that we really need to focus on, and I'd like to touch on that in a moment. But I think one thing that's very important to keep in mind, my county has 13 districts, and they range from the fifth largest district in the state, 62,000, which is Elk Grove, to a district with about 230 or 40 students given the time of the year. So there's a great variety of capacity and needs and so on. But I think it's important to understand the context into which all of this stuff dropped, meaning the new Common Core, the LCAP, the LCFF. So number one, even with the push now for local control and of funding, no functions have been taken away from any districts. In other words, if you count the bills that were passed last year, we're continuing to ask this, that, and the other thing additionally from districts. None of that has stopped, and it's going on now. If you take a look at, there are bills to require many more functions and reports just around student expulsions and suspensions. There's a whole coterie of bills from the Attorney General wanting you to do a lot more things. Now, that's not to say those are not worthwhile things to do, but they are additional things on top of the no things being taken away. And in most other professions, if we want something done to a greater degree or something different done, we take away something that we're already being asked to do. Number two, during the recession period, huge cuts were made in the district offices. To keep the cuts away from the classroom, we cut huge amounts of capacity out of the school districts, and many of these were our neediest school districts, were the least able to survive the environment of the recession and the cuts. And it's especially important to understand, I was a district superintendent for 9 years, that in hard economic times, you do not do things like refresh technology. You let your machinery get older, and it's just like in your home. If you're in hard times, you're not going to replace the HVAC. You're going to fix the little compressor and call it a day. Districts also were subjected to a kind of a fire hose of new items raining down on them. The Common Core standards, the assessments, the materials, the new math framework, the new ELA framework, the new LCAP process, the new CTE standards, which are very good, which were mentioned. Now the new CTE grants, which again are extremely promising. But these are all things to do. Even more important, though, is that I think what's been oversold and overpromised is the resources coming to districts, on the average, were to get them back to the pre-recession levels, which were not very robust levels to begin with. Now, granted, many of our neediest, the districts with our neediest children are going to get more money, but as Rick Simpson said, it's a redistribution of money. It isn't net new money. Now, added on top of that is I call it a collision of interests. There's a collision of interests right now financially in the state, which is defined by what I call there's the stay solvent need, and there's the enhanced program need. And this was very, very clearly defined in the action the state took this year on the budget. And in the budget, the state defined a process for increasing district contributions to STRS, the teacher retirement system. Now, why was that? Well, in order to stay solvent as a state, we have to beef up the teacher retirement fund. That's a real need. But what the state did was, rather than picking up that cost themselves, they said, well, districts, now you have local control over your funds. Please use your local control. Now think about this. The contribution of my districts in my county over the next 5, 6, 7 years is going to go from 8% to 21%. 8% to 21%, and that's all going to have to come out of the district share. So now, obviously, no one understands that. No one among the constituency understands it. But I think it's very important. And then the final point I'll make is that even with the supposed demise of the categoricals, we are still fighting the program silos. Not everybody is sold on the idea of local control funding. There are many, many rearguard actions. John Fensterwald knows this. Try to write an article in his blog and see what comes back if you're for the local control model. So anyway, I think all of that is very important to understand as context. So let me talk a little bit about LCAP, and I'll double it back to show you how it relates to Common Core. We've been working over the last 3 years or so with our districts on Common Core, our 13 districts, and I think our staff has done a pretty good job of it in Sacramento County. So when we approached development of the LCAPs, we decided to start very early in working with our districts and to really integrate the continued development of Common Core implementation with the LCAPs, understanding that the LCAP and the local control funding needed to be the vehicle for funding the further development and implementation of the Common Core. So we brought all of our districts in, and we asked them to bring not just the curriculum person, but the business department, CBO, business department manager. And we also wanted them to sit down and work together so that they could help one another and share ideas, and so that they didn't have to reinvent the wheel. And we wanted to make sure that, as John was saying, that they really covered all the bases that were expected to go into the LCAPs and not leave things out or not short shrift items. And one of the big questions that came up right away is, are you supposed to define the base program and describe the base program? Yes, you are supposed to describe the base program, not just the add-on program for the supplemental and concentration grant students. So I think over the last 5 or 6 months in working with them, we've been able to bring them along, and I just brought a couple of the plans because I'm proud to say that a lot of the plans do include, this is Elk Grove's plan, I'm just holding that up, that has an extensive incorporation of future things like the next generation science standards looking ahead. But that really brings me to my final point about LCAP and the Common Core implementation, is there's vast variation in the capacity of districts, be they large or small. It's not defined by how large you are necessarily. It's more defined by what kind of internal capacity you have to bring people to bear on doing the implementation right now. But more to the point, it's defined by the fact that in our state, if I stacked up probably the 20 or 25 largest districts, I would say it'd be about 50-50. I'd say about half of them were capable of and conditioned to thinking ahead. So they're not 3 years behind, they're 3 years ahead in putting together plans and mobilizing people to get this done. The others are not unwilling to do that. They're just not capable of doing it for a whole variety of reasons. They're basically getting through the night. They're getting through this week and next week, and they're getting through the end of the month, and the paycheck runs out, and they're really scrambling. So I think a lot of what we have to work on, whether it's at the state level with counties, locally with our providers like Pivot, is really beefing up the capacity of our districts. And a lot of this, I will say to you, is very much connected to the stability and continuity of their leadership. Unfortunately, a lot of the districts that we have, they change superintendents every 2 or 3 or even 4 years. And when you look across the state at how do districts do when that happens, they don't do very well at all. The districts that seem to do well are the ones that have great continuity and consistency in their leadership, which allows them to engender the trust and the relationships with all of their collaborators, teachers and others, and to really get the job done. So I will stop there.
Great, thanks. And Shannan, from point of view of a teacher and a member of the CTA, I believe you
Sure.
were called. Yes.
I'm going to target my comments at both the classroom level, but also the district level. And I know that Superintendent Gordon covered some of the context, but I am going to reiterate a little bit from a teacher's perspective. That coming out of, all of the comments being talked about where we want to go, you have to acknowledge where we're starting. So class sizes grew dramatically in most districts. Resources were cut at district office, but so were learning supports at school sites. Counselors, nurses, mental health workers, social workers, a lot of the supports, direct supports to students, have been pulled from the classrooms. We know that we need to build a lot of those direct supports to students back into the infrastructure to make sure that we are addressing the equity issue. Then we move to, we have 2 of the most dramatic reforms to hit education at the same time. So we have Common Core coming in, which teachers are excited about, by and large, as well as district leaders. And we get the message, okay, districts, put together a plan to do this completely new instructional approach for students. And we want details. We're going to have to figure it out as we go. We know that we're going to have to retool the instructional practice of teachers and move more to the engagement and allowing students to take ownership of their learning. But you can't put us in a room, give us the materials, which aren't ready anyway, give us some type of pacing guide, because this is about individualizing instruction. So we ourselves, as professionals, have to get messy in this. We're gonna make mistakes. And as a parent, my boys are not quite in school, but I don't like the idea of people experimenting, but folks, we have to be honest. We cannot move from the old standards to the new instructional approach and think we're gonna get there like that. It's impossible. And if we're not honest with the public about that, we're gonna be in for a world of hurt, and the pushback on Common Core in this state is gonna grow. So we're in the process of figuring out, how do we retool? Well, we also know that not all of our teachers and professionals' needs are the same. So we know we're going to individualize for students, but a lot of districts are packaging development and training all teachers the same way. Our teachers' needs are dramatically different. People who came in under NCLB, as you've read in the research, but also some of the comments from the first panel, there are people who were on pacing guides and scripted curriculum and have never had to engage in it. Then we have other people who are veterans who know how to do that. Don't put them in the same room and give them the same training, please. Right? Laughs, we know. We wouldn't expect that for our students either. Then the LCAP, the LCFF comes, And we know there's going to be a local accountability plan, and there should be. But the specifics on what needed to be in the LCAP came out very late. So we were scrambling, trying to figure out how do we create a plan that's visionary about where we want to go in this amount of time with this much input from this many people. So I believe that for most districts and teachers, we did the best that we could. And I know from San Juan, which is where I teach and work, that we already have plans for what we're going to do for the revisions. We put together the best plan we could on the amount of time we had, with knowing that we're dealing with Common Core implementation, with a dramatic reduction of resources. So those are not excuses, that's just where we're starting from. Now, when we think about moving forward, I think the LCAP is going to be a critical component in how we talk about education, our schools, and what success looks like for students. I am thrilled that we're going to have a better assessment working with the Smarter Balance Consortium. But I will tell you, as a teacher of 12 years in a Title I school that was labeled a failing school, and as David Plank mentioned earlier, I'm also a California Teacher of the Year from 2011. So I think that gives me street credibility to talk about instruction. And now I just thought lost my own train of thought. I apologize. So when we're looking at what we need to do with the LCAP, it seems like lock, stock, and barrel, everyone has already said, oh, these assessments are going to tell us how we're doing with Common Core. I really have hope that they're going to be better assessments. I really hope they are. And knowing that Linda Darling-Hammond's working on it does give me a lot of faith. But as a teacher, looking at the old tests, when everyone thought those were the truth about how we were doing, I didn't value those assessments. And now everyone can publicly say, oh, we know those weren't good assessments. But it was sacrilegious at the time to say that. So I would just ask you all to suspend judgment as we move into having the accountability measures come in with Smarter Balance to say, are these good assessments? If they're not, let's talk about what we need to do, and let's please not just take them and say, oh, this is the holy grail about how schools are doing. And if they are good assessments, please let's put them in the context of a well-rounded education system, and that's where the LCAP comes in. The state has defined certain components that must be included in the LCAP, but as local education communities, we should be working together to say, what do we want for our students and children in our area? What do we want? What does it look like? And how do we move beyond the quantification of everything? I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by that. Student suspension rates. Okay, so everyone knows that that's one of the components that's in there. Well, if suspension rates drop, and you go talk to the teachers and they say disruptions in the learning environment are up, then I would ask you, who cares about the reduction of suspension rates? So how do we manage that we know we have to have quantifiable data, and we're going to get some from the state level? How do we manage that? How do we balance that with a well-rounded education with enrichment and the arts for students that we all want for our own children? As parents, we want that. So how do we balance those things and come together as a community to put into context what success looks like for our students and our schools?
And Rick, from CORE, you and your superintendents have put Common Core implementation at the center of your strategy for a longer time, really, than other California school districts. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and actually I'll be real brief, and I know so we can take questions. But I think I'll just go right, because I agree with pretty much everything that's been said. I really appreciate all your comments. But from our perspective, I think our biggest angst point, and I'll just cut right to it, is time. We feel like we're actually making decent progress, but there's just so much more to do, and we're nowhere near where we need to be. And as you said, we started early. So, and I think one danger we have is too often sort of saying everything's going great, because even if it is, it's not going great on trajectory to get us ready when we need to be ready for the kids going through the system. And really, I'll just, I would point as my biggest area of concern. And then more opportunity for us all to learn from each other. We're not waiting for someone to come and give us the answer. I don't think that exists. But we're actually making progress throughout the state and country, learning about this. And so more opportunities to find each other, and I feel that I think are going to be critical for success moving forward. And I'll leave it at that. So you can, one brief so you can.
Okay, well, that was artfully brief. That was
Yeah.
Good. And we did run over a little bit over what I expected on time. So I will open the floor to questions. And I know I shut down a question in the last session. Would you like to ask your question now? I know it was a question. It was a question for Rick Simpson, and he's left the room. But I'm sure these people can answer it.
It wasn't actually. My question was, given now that we're at this point, by the way, I'm Jonathan Peterson from the California STEM Learning Network, to reflect on where Common Core implementation has come so far. What can we learn from this process, knowing that who knows how many years down the road or the next standards that have to be implemented, like the next generation science standards, are going to be happening soon? What can we learn from how Common Core has worked, whether the district level or from a state perspective, to inform not just the conversation about Common Core, but how we're doing with standards implementation, and what can we write for the history books on this process at this point?
That's a good question.
That's a great question, and my answer would be it's still in draft form. There's, we're flying the plane while we're making it, is, an old adage that we are doing the best we can to figure it out. Some districts and some classrooms have certain pieces as well-oiled machines, and other pieces are not quite up and running. So I think from my perspective and from a classroom perspective, I think it's too early to be able to tell you exactly what that looks like.
I would just build off of Liz Guillen's comment earlier, in that when we did the last set of standards, we at least had a outside independent evaluator that was looking at across the state how well the standards were being implemented in classrooms in terms of professional development, instructional materials. Students were surveyed to see how well they thought they knew. And I think we need to be doing that again, and we're not. There are some surveys that are going on, but not a systematic state-sponsored independent evaluator survey where we're really checking for understanding and implementation the way we should be.
Great. Are there other questions? Derry?
Hi, thanks for all your comments. I'm interested in the research that you did. What did you find out about districts that are having more problems with this than others? So I guess the first part of that is a lot of the research looked at individual districts in detail, and I wonder how randomized those districts were, and would you see districts that were really having trouble with this? And if so, what do these impending disasters look like? What is likely to happen, and what do you think needs to be done to help them?
I think it's a great question. Dave, I'm going to ask you to address that first, because I think you have the sort of most randomized sample of districts here.
Well, again, I think the biggest problem that districts have is a lack of depth and sophistication of understanding about what the task is. Because in a lot of cases, in a lot of places in education, we implement a project or a program. And it's very easy to say, well, the Common Core is a project or a program. You give some training, and you have some Common Core lessons, and call it that. That's not what we're asking for. We're asking for a major to Nancy Brownell's point, we're asking for a major refinement of the system in which we're not tossing out everything we know and we've been doing, but we're organizing it and delivering it in a much different way. And that's, as Shannan pointed out, that's very, very complicated, particularly since we have teachers with different sets of experiences and orientations. So I would say I'd say that's the big, and some districts have a great capacity to understand what the task is and people to help others do it, and others would not.
So I think it's a great question because, and again, when you look at the research that we did, what we identified is that districts who are moving forward on implementation successfully are taking one or two things on at a time, right, in terms of Common Core implementation. I think what we've seen in some districts that are perhaps having challenges is initiative multiplication. And it's a problem that's endemic, I think, in education, but it's the notion that you always just add another initiative instead of subtracting initiatives that previously were developed. And then the other thing, too, is, and again, this gets to the LCAP, refining down what is the most important initiative, right? What are the most important things that you think you can do to drive change all the way down to the school and classroom level, and prioritizing those. In some of the districts that we're working in, there are dozens of initiatives occurring simultaneously. And that actually, I think, is one of the biggest detriments to either implementing Common Core effectively or NGSS or any of these other areas. Folks have to prioritize what it is that they're going to make, what they think is going to make the biggest change. And they have to prioritize it often at political risk for themselves, right? You often add initiatives because it makes everybody happy politically. But refining down to the essence and saying we're going to do these two things and not do these 10 other things can often be a very politically negative thing for districts and superintendents and boards.
Okay, yes, please.
Both of the last questioner and the last speaker really focus on what I was going to say, which is that we just had a meeting with one of the school board members because, as Shannan has indicated, all of the instructions from the state about how to write the LCAP and what the template should look like and how you're going to fill it out came very late in the game. And we, too, constantly were calling, asking, when is it going to come out so we can comment on it? We are the public. I'm from the League of Women Voters. And nobody could answer that because they didn't have the form yet. But when the form came out, it was very interesting. There were a lot of shortcuts that were taken along the way, but the prioritizing of what you wanted to focus on for LCAP money were very interesting, and I'm quoting more or less from what our school board member said, which was that they're focusing on teacher training for Common Core, cultural competence, more teachers of color, with a very specific goal, using that money to increase minority teachers of color by 2% for the next 5 years. And so this was an attempt to take a real irritant in our district where we can do wonderful things for kids at the top levels of academic life, but we have had struggle after struggle to deal with the achievement gap. And so the priority was, look, you've got a problem on your hands, deal with it. And that's why the focus was so much on not just professional development, but professional searches. And I was very proud that they had got that far.
Great, thank you. Carrie?
The template certainly came out quite late and introduced a lot of procedural challenges and just bureaucratic challenges at the local level. But we are left wondering whether a good plan should be dependent on a form. And there are districts that all districts had the guidance in the statutory language in July of 2013 and had time to think about how they were going to address those 8 priority areas. And I might just posit back that regardless of the timing, there are ways to have a thoughtful planning process as a district, and many do, and we're able to, even with that difficult form, find a way to present the information. We certainly hope that the form can help present a good plan, but the plan should not be dependent upon the form. We did hear from Galt School District, where we had looked at Common Core practice, that they were already moving along with some really innovative and promising Common Core implementation efforts thanks to a Race to the Top grant that they received. And LCAP did throw in a wrench because they felt like they had to retrofit a little bit, like, okay, now I've got to do this LCAP thing, we're already doing this other thing. But what it did do is it enhanced the community engagement process in that district, and it forced them to justify the plan that they were already working on for Race to the Top and Common Core and take it to their community, and they feel like their plan was better as a result.
We have time for one more question. Otherwise, I was given one explicit instruction at the beginning of this meeting, and I forgot it. So now here we are. But it's still relevant, which is that there's one very explicit rule in this room, which is you're not allowed to bring food and drink into the room. And I was told to say that at the beginning, but I will say it now as we go to lunch. The lunch, you will be directed to lunch out this door. And the lunch is in one room, but there are actually 2 rooms where you can eat your lunch. So you have to go to one room, and then you can divide yourselves up among the rooms as you choose. And we'll be back at 2 o'clock, and Julie Marsh will talk about the results of the PACE poll that were released yesterday. So I will see you then. Thank you very much. Yes, and thank our panel. It was a marvelous panel, and thank you to them.